has concluded. So first, it might be just helpful to step back and summarize just how horrific this war is, the scale of which we really haven't seen in Europe since the Second World War. Of course, with the fog of war, it's always sometimes difficult to get information that's 100% reliable. But General Milley, our chair of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, indicated not long ago that an estimated 100,000 Ukrainian and 100,000 Russian soldiers, and that number has actually gone up now to 200,000 Russian soldiers, have either died or been wounded. And the UK Defense Ministry reported a few weeks ago that the number of Russian soldiers has now reached, as I mentioned a few seconds ago, 200,000. General Milley also indicated that perhaps as many as 40,000 Ukrainian civilians have been killed or injured. And that's a much higher number than had been previously reported. There have been over 5,000, not 500, 5,000 missile strikes on Ukraine, many of them on purely civilian targets. There have been over 8,000 air raid warnings across the country. And very often when I'm talking to family and friends on the phone, through WhatsApp, I get, John, I've got to drop off, the air raid sirens just went off and I've got to head to the bomb shelter. And again, more recently we've seen a tremendous launch of missiles, hundreds of missile strikes on the Ukrainian power grid, destroying over 50% of the grid and plunging millions and millions of innocent civilians into darkness without heat, electricity, and water in the middle of the winter. In other words, Russia is literally trying to freeze to death 40 million Ukrainians. Hundreds of billions of dollars of civilian infrastructure have been destroyed, including hundreds and thousands of homes and over 100,000 civilian buildings and schools. Over 1,200 hospitals and medical facilities have been damaged, and 150 have been completely destroyed. Of course, you've seen in the news reports over the last year the stories of maternity wards that have been attacked by Russian missiles. 170,000 square kilometers of land will need to be demined once this war is over, demined from Russian mines. And estimates for what it will cost to rebuild Ukraine range as high as a trillion dollars. And of course, there's 7 million Ukrainian refugees in Europe, and elsewhere another 6 million who are internally displaced. So if you put this into context, it took 4 years for 1 million Syrian refugees to come into Europe. And with this war that Putin has unleashed on Ukraine, we have 13 million people on the move in a matter of days. And then, of course, the world food prices have exploded, given Ukraine's inability to export food as it did before the war, causing really severe hunger issues in many of the world's poorest countries. And finally, the most horrific in my mind, is the looting, the mass looting, the raping, the summary executions, and the wanton destruction, and the thousands of war crimes committed by the Russians. We see on the news the torture chambers and the mass graves in cities such as Bucha, Irpin, Izium, and many other liberated towns. And for me, the truly horrifying fact is that all of this is just really the tip of the iceberg. And I have no doubt that we will all be stunned, literally stunned, at the actual figures once this war is over and all of the Russian war crimes have been uncovered and investigated. And so as I look at all this needless death and destruction, I can only ask myself, and I suspect many of you are asking the same question, and for what? And for what? Why? And so, in the face of this really incredible human tragedy, we as Rotarians have responded as one would really expect. Shortly after the war began, we set up a disaster response fund for Ukraine, and within a matter of weeks, Rotarians from around the world contributed more than $15 million to this fund. It set a record for the quickest amount of money we've been able to raise for any disaster short of polio, really in our history. Under the terms of that fund, any Rotary district could apply for a grant of up to $25,000 for relief for Ukraine, whether it be for Ukraine or for refugees or work with Ukraine outside of the country. The neighboring countries of Ukraine could apply for a grant of up to $100,000. And then for the Ukrainian district, we had at the start of the war about 1,100 Rotarians in Ukraine, 60-some clubs. We opened for them 3 streams of $100,000. They used one stream for ambulances and fire trucks. They used the other stream for medical equipment. And they used the third stream, this was very clever on their part, to give micro grants to each of the Rotary clubs in Ukraine to do something in their local communities. And of course, whether you're getting a 25,000 grant or 100 grants or 3 Ukrainian grants, once that grant was exhausted, you could apply for another and another and another. And what's interesting, and if there's no better example in my view of the importance of having impact in your local community, in that in Ukraine, membership since the start of the war has increased by 25%. So this is a country that's literally getting bombed back to the Stone Ages. And the people in Ukraine are seeing the extraordinary work that our Rotarians are doing. And they're saying in the middle of this war, in the middle of the destruction, we want to join this organization because it does so much. And that $15 million now has been exhausted. We've respent it. We've spent it already. And just recently, the Rotary Foundation trustees opened this fund again. It's now been reopened. So please, if there's an interest on the part of this club or this district or neighboring districts to help Ukraine, that fund is open. We have about a backlog of about $700,000 worth of proposals that have come in from Ukraine, from the neighboring countries, and from outside Ukraine. Those will be filled first once the fund is repleted, and then thereafter we would begin servicing and dealing with new grants. Over 350 grants were approved from almost 30 countries. We had over 20 multi-district proposals. Districts could pool their 25,000 together so that they could get economies of scale, buy ambulances, fire trucks, medical equipment at scale, and reduce the cost. And the U.S. was by far the largest country with over 100 grants, followed by, not surprisingly, Ukraine and the United Kingdom. But that, in my view, is just part of what we've done as an organization. That's the $15 million that we got through the Rotary Foundation for service around the world, working either locally or directly with Ukraine to help. I got a call just before Christmas from a group of Rotarians that are on the Polish-Ukrainian border from New Hampshire. They raised $2.3 million for Ukraine. And they're at the border with a whole convoy of trucks bringing in medical equipment. They wanted to call me to let me know that they were doing this. Well, that doesn't show up in any of our Rotary International or Rotary Foundation data because they've done that independently and directly. So I would estimate, based on the anecdotes that we're hearing and the information we're hearing, that there's probably another 15 to 20 million worth of aid that has gone directly from clubs and districts to Ukraine. So as an organization, since this war started, I think we can probably say with a fair amount of confidence that we've probably given anywhere from $30 to $40 million to Ukraine in relief assistance since this war started. And of course, that is an incredible accomplishment, and I think all of us as Rotarians can be extraordinarily proud of what we've done as an organization to help Ukraine. And of course, all of this is very, very personal to me. My parents are from Ukraine. They came to the States in 1949 after having spent 4 years in a displaced persons camp in southern Germany. They came, actually my mother's family came to Pennsylvania. My grandfather was a Ukrainian Catholic priest, and his first parish was in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. And my mother went to her first year in high school at Fox Chase, which was a Ukrainian school outside of Philadelphia, and then she wound up moving to Detroit, which is where my father went to, and so they met in Detroit, and that's where I'm from originally. I grew up speaking Ukrainian at home. We had a very strong Ukrainian American community in Detroit. And then my wife Marga and I lived in Ukraine from 1991 to 1996. I still have a great deal of family and friends and former colleagues in Ukraine. And so again, I think all of us, and I'm particularly touched by the response the Rotary's had in Ukraine. This is what Rotary is all about. It's about stepping up in times of need. It's about adapting. It's about springing into action. It's about using our local presence and global footprint to make a difference. saving lives, providing hope, and really a shining example of service above self. So again, thank you for all that you're doing, that Rotarians in Western Pennsylvania are doing, and what our organization is doing to help Ukraine. So this leads me really to the second part of my comments, and that's what's next. And what will Rotary's role be in the next phase when this terrible war is finally over? And I think to answer that question, it's useful to get some historical perspective on where Ukraine has come from and where it needs to go. But I think it also it's a moment for us to realize that any one of us, given the right circumstances and frankly serendipity, can make a meaningful difference and contribute, even in a small way, to a country's future and history. Over the last 500 years, there have been many key moments in Ukraine's history. I personally think there are about 8 that really stand out in my mind. I won't go through all 8. That's not a history lecture, but I would like to perhaps start with the 4th. My wife Marga's from Argentina. We were married in a town called Santa Fe in 1989, and literally 2 weeks after our wedding, we moved to Moscow. I'd like to say that Marga's probably the first and last. We moved in early January of 1990, so I'd like to say she's probably the first and last Argentine to have ever taken a honeymoon in Moscow in January. And I went to Moscow. I was a lawyer at that time, and I was with the firm Baker McKenzie, which at the time was the largest international firm in the world, and we were one of the first firms to open in Moscow. So I moved there in early '90 to help open that office. And in the spring of 1991, we moved to Ukraine. I took a year sabbatical from the firm to work as a legal advisor in the Ukrainian Parliament, funded by George Soros's Open Society Foundation. And it was an incredibly interesting experience. We got there in the spring of '91, and I had my ID card with the hammer and sickle on it, and free access pretty much to most government buildings in Ukraine. It was still the Soviet Union, of course. The Soviet Union hadn't yet collapsed. The painter Andy Warhol says that every person gets their 15 minutes in the sun at some point. And so my 15 minutes really came in August of 1991. On August 18th, 17th and 18th, I was with Marga and a Ukrainian lawyer that I would later hire when we opened our office, Baker McKenzie office in Ukraine in 1992. We were in the town called Zaporizhia, which you've seen on the news. It's very close to where that nuclear power plant is that the Russians have occupied and now really put the whole world at risk of a really serious nuclear catastrophe. But we were out there for a rock concert. There's a whole series of these progressive rock concerts which were popping up all over Ukraine at the time. And we were walking along the Dnipro River. I was walking along the river with Alexei, the lawyer we were with. And I said, Alexei, this is incredible. Here I am, son of, Ukrainian bourgeois nationalists is what the Soviets called my parents' generation. I've got this ID with a hammer and sickle on it. I've got free access to all these buildings. I'm working in the Ukrainian parliament. There has to be some counter-revolution. Something has to happen. I can't imagine Moscow's going to let this stuff continue, or the reactionary elements within the Soviet system. So we flew back to Kyiv that night, and then the morning of the 19th, I get a call at 7 in the morning from Alexei. He says, remember what we were talking about last night? And I said, yeah. He goes, turn on the TV. I turned on the TV, and a coup had taken place in Moscow. And that was bad news, because it was like, this is a step backwards. A coup happened. And so my wife, who's, again, from Argentina, has lived through a number of coups. She says, we're out of here. And I said, no. This is history in the making here. We're staying. And so I went over to the Parliament building and spent the 3 days of the coup in the Ukrainian Parliament building outside of Leonid Kravchuk's office. He wound up being eventually Ukraine's first president, but at that time he was the Speaker of the Parliament, which was in effect the de facto leader of Ukraine, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. And Boris Yeltsin gets on the tank on the 21st in front of the White House in Moscow, and in effect puts an end to the coup. So the question then came up in Ukraine: how are we going to react to the events in Moscow? The coup failed. What is Ukraine's reaction going to be? And Parliament was out of session at that time, so they called an emergency session for the 24th of August, 1991. The night of the 23rd, the night before the session, the Democratic minority in the Parliament, the Communists had about 75% of the deputies, the Ukrainian Democratic opposition had about 25%. The Democrats met to say, okay, what are we going to do tomorrow? What's going to be our reaction to this coup in Moscow at the session on the 24th? And a huge debate broke out between the group, where one group said, let's go for independence tomorrow. And another group says, well, let's wait. We don't want to be an independent Ukraine run by the communists. So let's deal with the communists first, and then we'll worry about independence later. And for me, sitting there listening to all this stuff, it was like being, I don't know, in Philadelphia on July 3rd, 1776, and seeing Madison and Jefferson and all these guys talk about, gee, what are we going to do tomorrow? What are we going to put in the Declaration of Independence? And at the end of the evening, they decided, let's go for independence tomorrow. And so they began preparing all these different decrees that they wanted to have the Parliament consider the next day. Nationalizing Communist Party property, depoliticizing the KGB and the army, all kinds of stuff. And they're drafting away, and all of a sudden one of the deputies comes up to me and says, John, we've got a big problem. And I said, what is it? He goes, we've got all these decrees we want the Parliament to vote on the next day. We have no way of photocopying them. And I'm like, well, and photocopiers was very hard to get in Ukraine at the time. I said, go to the Secretariat of the Parliament. They have a copy machine there. I'm sure you can get a copy there. And they go, no. The Secretariat is controlled by the communists. They'll never copy this stuff for us. And I had a tiny Canon PC7 copier at the time. And Marga, my wife, had just brought a box of A4 paper from the Baker McKenzie office in Moscow. She used to have to go once a month to shop in Moscow. So I had the paper. So with a student, I said, give me all these decrees. So with a student from the university, we took those decrees and we made 450 copies of each one. We only had enough paper to do 4 per page, so we had to shrink it all down. We finished around 7 in the morning. I go over to the Parliament building and I hand the box of documents to the deputy head of the Democratic opposition. The communists kind of freak out, and where all this come from? Session started, and 6 hours later, Ukraine declared independence. So I don't know whether my copy machine really was declared independence anyhow, but it did give me my 15 minutes in the sun, at least give me the hope and at least the wishful thinking perhaps that my little intervention with that copy machine was able to help result in the declaration of Ukrainian independence. So Ukraine became independent. They held a referendum in December of 1991 where all the regions of Ukraine overwhelmingly voted for independence, including Crimea, a small majority, but 52% voted for independence. And that was basically the end of the Soviet Union. And so then as the country progressed along its sort of path of nationhood, it was now independent. But because it was in the Soviet Union, everything was centralized through Moscow. They not only had the difficult task of moving from communism to capitalism, like Poland did, like Hungary, the Czech Republic, and the other Warsaw Pact countries, but they also had to build state institutions from scratch. And that was a really, really difficult challenge. And so they went through a 15-year period, 20-year period of kind of quasi-stagnation, some change, et cetera, and then in 2004 there came the Orange Revolution. They peacefully, really, I guess only one person died. They died of a heart attack, really. An older person who was participating in the protests, and they took a huge step forward in terms of their statehood. And then came 2014 with the Maidan revolution, where the pro-Russian government was not moving Ukraine toward Europe. The population wanted that. They came out, overthrew, or at least forced a change in government. And then came Putin shortly thereafter with his little green men, occupied Crimea, and began this war. Actually, the Ukraine is fighting started already in 2014. Occupied a part of Donbass and really started a war with Ukraine. But what those two events did, Orange Revolution and Maidan, is it began that process of really uniting Ukraine as a country, which had been deeply divided before that. Catholic West, Orthodox East, Ukrainian-speaking West, Russian-speaking East. Part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in Poland in the West historically, part of the Russian Empire in the East. And so it's a country with a lot of inherent tensions. And so the concept of a united Ukrainian nation took a while to develop. And that was given a big step forward with the Orange Revolution and Maidan in 2014. And then comes this butcher Putin, who begins this war in February of 2022. And what's ironic here is that action by Putin starting this war was in many ways the seventh step in this 8-step process of developing Ukrainian country, because everything he has done has backfired, completely backfired. It's united Ukrainians more than ever. The vast majority of Ukrainians who are speaking Russian are now moving to Ukraine. The cities he's destroying that you see on the news, Mariupol, Chernihiv, Sumy, all these places he's literally bombing back to the Stone Ages, are all predominantly Russian-speaking cities. He's put Ukraine on the map. Everybody knows that Ukrainians are not now Russians. Zelensky, the president, is kind of this century is Churchill with the way he stepped up with the war. And so everything he's done is backfired, and he has perhaps done more than any person in recent history to pull Ukrainians together and to move Ukraine even quicker along that path of becoming a united, true country, a united people. And our actions as Rotarians, your support, are really contributing to the building of Ukrainian nation. Because again, without people, there is no nation. And I think your efforts, our efforts as Rotarians, directly supporting the Ukrainian people, allowing them to survive, really create the conditions for Ukraine's next phase. So my view, and I'll close with this, there's one last phase in the development of Ukrainian nationhood. We had Orange Revolution, we had the Maidan, we've got this war now, which has really brought Ukraine together, perhaps really solidified Ukraine as a united country. But there is one last phase, and that has to do with the reconstruction. Once this war is over, obviously, the country is going to have to be rebuilt. But when I talk about reconstruction, it's not just rebuilding the buildings and the roads and the bridges. There's one last step that Ukraine needs to take, and that has to do with the rooting out of corruption. Prior to the war, Ukraine still had significant corruption issues, significant rule of law issues. The judicial system still was in dramatic need of reform. Now with this war ending, it's that last step, in my view, of creating Ukraine statehood and nationhood. This isn't the moment for Ukraine to finally deal with this issue of corruption, rule of law, and the judicial system. And here's where Western reconstruction money is going to be extremely important. Not only to rebuild Ukraine, but I would say we need to play somewhat hardball with Ukrainians and say, we're going to give you this money, you deserve it, we're going to rebuild your country, but the price is going to be truly to stamp out this corruption, truly to root out the corruption, truly to reform your system, to put these oligarchs in jail and break the stranglehold that they have on the economy. And that's why not only is it the leverage we can exert with the reconstruction effort, but also EU membership. EU membership is an incredible carrot for countries to reform. I was practicing law in the Czech Republic after Ukraine in the run-up to EU accession. It was very clear that the prospect of joining the EU accelerated dramatically much needed reforms. So the Ukrainians need a realistic shot at joining the EU. Macron said last year that it's going to take decades for them to join. That, in my view, is a flawed approach. They need to realize that they have a realistic chance, if they do the right things, to join the EU, and certainly in the medium term. So again, this is Ukraine's moment now. When the war ends, it's a greater moment to take that final step. And I think this is where Rotary can play a huge role, not even so much in the reconstruction piece, but in trying to, the reconstruction portion, but also building peace. You know, the hatred now between Ukrainians and Russians is incredible. A whole generation now of Ukrainian young people who, are, what they're seeing, and they're seeing their country destroyed by the Russians. It's going to take generations really to bridge the differences now between Ukraine and Russia. But it has to happen at some point. And I think civil society is going to play a huge role in that effort. We're already seeing the effort that Rotary is doing in Ukraine. And so I see our role as an organization, not only helping with the reconstruction going forward, but also playing a pivotal role in trying to bring together Ukrainians and Russians and bridging this huge chasm, which has resulted, as a result of this war, it's going to take a lot of work and effort to overcome. So again, thank you again for having me. Thank you for all that we're, as an organization, doing for Ukraine. Very interesting time, obviously, for the world. And again, Rotary has always played a huge role and will continue to play a huge role in these sorts of things, such as Ukraine and conflicts elsewhere in the world. So thank you for having me.